Hello, my name is Dr. Emily Hauser. I'm a lecturer at the University of Exeter, and today in this module we're going to be talking about women in Homer. I wanted to start with this first module by thinking a little bit about why we should talk about women at all, why women matter when we're thinking about Homer. And I wanted to kind of begin with a scene which is really important to thinking about the role of women in Homer, which is in Book 6 of the Iliad. And this is a moment where Hector has left the war, he's gone back to Troy and he's behind the walls of Troy, and he meets with his wife, Andromache. And her name, Andromache, means man-fighter, okay? So she's behind the walls, she's not fighting, and she brings her son to Hector, and Hector, she tries to give Hector some battle advice. And Hector says, "Thank you very much, but please go back home. War will be a concern for men and me most of all. For you, your concern is weaving." And so it seems like we've had this kind of very clearly delineated roles. Even though we have this woman whose name is man-fighter, what her role really is to be at home with the baby and to go back home into the house and to do weaving. And what men do is war. So it seems we've got this kind of opposition between men and women. Men are active, women are passive, men are the speakers, women are the silent ones who go home and do their weaving. And by this view, this is a very firmly man's world, and women really don't have much of a place in it. But there are these really important women throughout the Troy myth, especially I'm thinking of Helen of Troy. We've also got Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, Andromache, as we've seen, the wife of Hector. And these women appear again and again throughout the myth. In some cases, as with Helen, they actually are the reason behind the entirety of the myth, right? The entirety of the Trojan War begins because of Helen, because of this contest over the most beautiful. So we need to think a little bit more about what's being said by someone like Hector when he tells Andromache to go home. Do we really take that at face value? Or is there a little bit more to think about when we're thinking about women in the Homeric epics? And I would argue that there is, and that women do matter for a couple of reasons. First reason is, as I said, that the stories depend on them. That these are stories that begin because of women. We've got Helen beginning the Trojan War, but we've also got the Iliad beginning because of a quarrel over two women, Briseis and Chryseis. These are two slave women who were taken during the war by the Greeks, and the quarrel over them between Agamemnon and Achilles is the entire reason for the beginning of the poem that we now know as the Iliad. So they're not just starting the myth like Helen, they're also starting the poetry. Briseis and Chryseis begin the poem. It's also the case that women's experiences do create a very different world and a very different view from that of the men's, and that Homer is certainly interested in exploring that different world. So we get these moments where the woman's world is kind of entered into, as when Hector in Book 6 goes into Troy. He meets with his mother, Hecuba, he meets with his sister-in-law, Helen, and then he meets with his wife. And we see all of these different roles. We see the world of peacetime, the world that could have been, as opposed to the world of the men. And for example, we also see this in Ithaca in the Odyssey, where in Book 1 we have Telemachus also saying a very similar thing to Penelope. He says, you know, Penelope tries to say something, he says, "Be quiet, mum, go upstairs. Be quiet, words are the concern of men right now." He says words, not war. But we have that very similar thing where Penelope's role is kind of delineated, and the world of men is created, is shaped in response to, in opposition to the world of the women. We also have instances where women are specifically acting as foils for men. So we have men and women pairs. A particularly resonant one is Penelope and Odysseus in the Odyssey, where we have Penelope's world at home in Ithaca and her cunning, her strategies against the suitors set against Odysseus's cunning as he voyages to come home. But we also have other pairs like Helen and Achilles, who are set against each other as both being half divine, both being kind of the best in their categories, the most beautiful and the finest warrior. And I think that these pairings, these male-female pairings, also help us to understand some of the major characters in new and different ways. But I also don't want to suggest that they're only important because they illuminate male themes, and I would argue that they are also important in their own right. They are complex and interesting characters who demonstrate their own agency, who interact with the men, as we've seen with Andromache. Although her role is to be silent, she does try and break beyond the boundaries and try and give battle advice. And so we see them kind of pushing against those norms in new and interesting ways, and I think that that is interesting in its own right. And finally, because we are in an era where gender is a priority and is a top concern, we have feminist theory that is addressing the Homeric epics and seeing them in new ways. And I think that this is a legitimate concern, that we need to say, yes, this is something that we care about. How can we bring our own concerns back to Homeric epic and help to read Homeric epic in a new and different way? And this is something that we as academics are doing all the time. We're saying, what can we bring with our new concerns and our new interests to the ancient world? And women is one of the big areas where we can really do that. So this is the positive take on things. This is how we can positively recover women, why women matter. But there's also a problem that I think we need to raise, which is that women are very difficult to recover, and their stories are there, they're there in the literature, but there are also problems with finding their stories. And one of the major problems with this is archaeology. And the reason is that women spent most of their time weaving. This was one of their major responsibilities, one of their major contributions to the household. And it's as we see with Hector, who tells Andromache, go home, look after the loom and the distaff, that's your work. But the problem is that weaving doesn't survive. So threads and wool, they don't survive in the archaeology, they disintegrate over time, as opposed to things like stone and brick that do survive. And so we don't have that evidence, that record of what women were doing, their lives, as opposed to men's lives, where we can have their spears, their swords, their shields, their helmets, all of those, the entrapments of war, they survive, but women's work doesn't survive, and so they're difficult to hear. We also, then, another way we might see women is in art. But art, as we think of, for example, statues, sculptures, vase paintings, typically are also by men. And when we see images of women, they are idealised, they are seen through a male eye. That's not to say that that's not interesting and important, but it's not really a way that we can kind of recover women's experiences in an authentic way. Finally, we have literature, and we do have to bear in mind, as with art, that literature is mostly male authored. We have some exceptions like Sappho, and she is incredibly important in recovering women's experiences. But if we're thinking of Homer, Homer is believed to have been a male poet, and later on I'll go through some theories, some wacky theories that suggested that he was a woman. But largely, given the social context, given the ethos, the kind of emphasis on heroism, the emphasis on the deeds of men, this seems to be a very male epic. And so, yes, we can recover women's experiences. Yes, we can look at women like Helen and Penelope, but we also have to bear in mind that this is being seen through a male eye and is being constructed in a very specific way for a specific purpose. So with that kind of caveat, I wanted to just foreground the next 4 modules, where we're going to be looking in a little bit more depth through the world of women in Homer specifically, so going through a little bit of the context in which these women were operating. We're going to be looking at Helen in particular and Penelope as 2 examples of some of the most important women in the epics. And we're going to look at some of the key moments where we see women operating, perhaps fighting against the boundaries that have been set up for them, or operating within them in the epic. So some key examples that we're going to be looking at will be the quarrel over Briseis and Chryseis in book 1 of the Iliad, Helen's weaving in book 3 of the Iliad, that's a key scene, book 6 of the Iliad, as we've already seen, with Hector meeting with Andromache and also Hecuba and Helen. We've got Briseis' lament for Patroclus in Iliad book 19, and then we've got in book 24 of the Iliad, we've got the 3 laments between Andromache, Helen and Hecuba that kind of set the seal on the epic. And then when we look at the Odyssey, we've got Penelope in book 1, where she's being told to go up to her bedroom by Telemachus, kind of setting the role of women. We've got the other women who intrude on the epic and try and hinder Odysseus' attempts to get home. So we have Circe, we've got Calypso, we've got Nausicaa. So these kind of mythical women who operate at the boundaries of the epic. And then we've got, finally, Penelope's recognition of Odysseus in the final books of the Odyssey as he's kind of welcomed back into the home. So in the next module, module 2, we're going to be looking at the world of women in Homer specifically and focusing in on that context.